So I've been stuck in a bit of a rabbit hole about what it means for me to be queer, what queerness even means in the modern world, and how to navigate the fact that I think for a lot of queer people there's a sort of undesired additional baggage that gets put on all of us to suddenly have to be like these masterful, knowledgeable experts of where we fit in the world and how. And because of that, there's just been a lot that I've been needing to unpack about life. So I am a gay, and as a part of that, I have a lot of extra baggage that gets placed on me and on my shoulders to try and make it so I have to understand all of the nuances of what it means to be queer and how queerness works. And I feel like for a lot of queer people, that is not an original warrior concern that I'm talking about here. I feel like the average queer person just kind of wants life to be simpler than it is, but then the realities of the world make it so you kind of have to be more vulnerable and laid bare than I think we would like it to be. And as a part of that, I feel like that I have a burden that's been placed on me of trying to understand queerness, what queerness is, and how to use it for good and for justice and all of that, but also at the exact same time, I was never given any proper introduction to it. I never was present for the onboarding of when I became gay, as much as I wish that I didn't have to miss that for brunch. And that's where I now find myself having to ask, what does it mean to be queer, and how do I go and make the world any better from here? So I've heard queer used in a lot of different contexts and in a lot of different ways. I've heard it used to describe every single person who is not exactly 100% neatly in the boxes of straight and cis. That would be the definition that CNN uses in their online guide to queerness, and also I imagine they probably use for their internal press materials. I also then read it, though, being used as like a modifier for other expressions of like common parts of the world, like indigiqueer and genderqueer. Or, most interestingly, I have heard some people say that it's been used as a slur before, which is weird for me, because I never grew up in a period where I really heard someone hucking around the word queer like an actual insult, like they actually meant to hurt you. I've only, even in a very conservative upbringing, really only heard it used as just sort of a descriptor of what someone is, and I've not heard it in that context. But apparently, that's very Gen Z, millennial of me because of that fact. Now, for me personally, and while I'm producing this video and as we go forward, the definition of queer that I'm using is, I think I actually kind of agree with like the basic people at CNN's definition, which is just, if you ain't straight and you ain't cis, well, welcome to the queers. And that can encompass a lot of different people. That encompasses probably all trans people of all flavors, non-binary as well. It includes intersex people, because to some degree I don't think any intersex person is necessarily cis in the way cis people would like that word to be defined. And it also includes all of the gays, which includes me in another way as well. And that's where, in two different ways, I'm a part of this, because I am a bisexual trans woman. Now, if that sounds like I'm just picking up debuffs in order to sound like I'm really interesting, I want to make this very clear. I didn't choose this. So this video really actually kind of started off as just a project about how to build queer solidarity, but I realized midway through writing that video that I actually was taking for granted this idea that queerness is just a catch-all term for not cis, not straight, more or less CNN's definition I actually found myself agreeing with the most while I was doing my initial digging. And that's where it got my brain turning on why do we have so many different definitions, and where do they all fit together, and do they get in the way at all of, like, queer solidarity? And it's at this point that I want to be clear. I haven't lost the plot of the video I actually meant to make when I started writing this script 3-4 months ago. I think where this video ultimately got a little off the rails, though, was me just trying to figure out how to define queer in, like, a way that's a little bit one notch better than, here's just what my brain intuitively thought. And I actually had to, like, read things like a loser in order to understand where this was going to go. And while I am going to pick a definition, and I promise I'm going to explain where it came from, so that way you can impress your friends at home knowing dumb fun facts about the history of the word queer, keep in mind 2 things. The first, I am not making this to be like, here is the definition, and all other definitions that disagree with me are bad and wrong. If you call yourself queer, but you are, like, a cis and straight person, but there's some other way in which you conceptualize yourself as queer, who am I to tell you you are not a part of the gays? The hang-up for me is how I want to define it, and how to make sure that I'm achieving good solidarity down the road. And that's the second part, is I promise, this video is not just a one-to-one recapping of the definition of queer with no actual rhyme or reason and no meaning behind why it is that I talked about this. This video is actually about something that matters, which is, how do we take that definition, this very broad, all-encompassing thing that holds a lot of different people, a lot of histories, a lot of baggage, a lot of stories, and we put together for ourselves a definition and a movement that actually encourages us to rise together, rather than where I think we sometimes fall, which is pulling each other down, demanding that our individual idiosyncrasies be taken seriously, when sometimes it just matters that a rising tide lifts all ships. And that's where we get to the main thesis of this video. Where if I were to summarize all of the work of this video down to just one question that I've been trying to answer, it's, what does it mean to be queer? And that is a question of both definitions and of political action. Because unfortunately for us, whether we like it or not, the fact that we are queer, at least I'm assuming you're queer, or you're a really good ally, or a really bad enemy. If you are queer with me, stay, because there is some good stuff here for us. But I am incapable of keeping the same thought for more than a second, I swear to God. Because whether we like it or not, at least I assume you're queer, you don't have to be, but I'm gonna assume it, we are stuck with having to bear the political consequences of the world and our successes and failures of navigating it, whether we like it or not. And we have to be prepared if we want to make the best of all of it. So, that's where I hope you're ready to come down a rabbit hole with me of what does it mean to be queer.
This is how we conceptualize human beings.
Wait, sorry, gotta stay monetized. You can't see what this is. Okay? So let's start with the part of this video that's gonna get it demonetized before it ever even had a chance, because, well, I don't think queer is a dirty word. Who knows what YouTube thinks in this economy? And that's where we're gonna have to just get into the weeds some, just a little bit, I promise there's just a little derail that happens somewhere in here about the definition and meaning of queer. So I think in order to make sure that we all are staying together here. So in order for us to be able to talk about who the queers are, we are also going to need to talk about who the not queers are. And I'm going to use a word that I think is going to rub some people the wrong way, but just hear me out. there are queers and normal people. A turn of phrase that I understand may have made some of you go, what are you talking about? I am normal, even though I'm queer. Just hear me out. The issue is when someone is an academic who has 80 paragraphs that they use in order to describe something, like the use of the word normal to describe a group of people, they get 80 paragraphs to nuance the ever-living hell out of that. Unfortunately for me, I would like to make sure that this video is not 2 hours long. I don't know how long it's going to be at this point, but I can guarantee you are probably getting heartburn right now seeing the little things scrolling on the bottom and seeing how much we got left here. So to keep it all simple, I'm using the word normal right now just to make sure that you all are able to follow with me on some academic literature that I have had to read that is about the queers v. non-queers. So that's where at some points during this video you may hear me using the word normal, or you may hear me quoting someone who uses the word like normal or normal society. Don't read into that as like a normative statement or like a statement of value or a statement of ethics. This is really more so just a framework for understanding like who has power and who doesn't. It's more of an observation of power distribution when we say that there's normal people and queer people. But when we're in the real world of like what is polite to say, normal is not being used to say better. So just keep that in mind as we go. Now, with that long monologue out of the way of trying to get you all okay that you're going to hear the word normal used to describe non-queer people for a bit, let me also then just address hot water thing number 2, and it's the fact that up to this point, I think I have now used a word that to some people over the age of 40 has been considered a slur for a while, and I've said it a lot in this video. I have also said the gays, and I also will probably say something else as we go that wasn't in my script, but I decided would be really funny to just drop in the middle of this. So for that, I have 2 defenses that I would like to give my way. First, I'm using the word in a non-slurry way. I think there's a real difference between me like telling someone they are a queer or like yelling at them like that's a queer little boy over there. That's weird. That's very 1910s. That's not cool. That's not what I'm doing. I'm using queer more as a statement of political nature, as a statement of categorization, of a statement of identity. It's not a statement of othering, which we'll get there. Don't worry. Now, the second part of my defense is that I am not an outside member looking in, trying to talk about a word that doesn't apply to me. I am a queer, I am a trans woman, and I am bi. And I have been in a lot of relationships that are, I would consider aggressively bisexual at this point, and I have been a trans woman for a while now. Maybe my whole life, but I'm gonna say at least 2 years. I want to be clear that when I'm using this word, if it ever does come across to you personally as like this is like kind of entering slurry territory and it's not me like quoting others, I get it, I understand it. If you're an older person, this may all be like kind of wild to you to hear someone so casually fine with dropping the Q word over and over. But again, I am coming at this from a place of I want that word to describe me, and I want to unpack the impact of that description and that identification for myself. And if you don't identify with it, that's fine. But can you please at least just meet me in the middle of at least understanding the solidarity that can then still be built, even if you choose to use the term to describe our community as gay, lesbian, bi, trans, plus, intersex, what have you, even if it's LGBTQ. It's like you want to bucket in a bunch of people using that. The Q, I think, though, simplifies a lot of this conversation of solidarity, and it makes it so I'm not having to list off alphabet soup of 5 different letters every time I want to really just describe all of that bucket in one word. So like please just roll with me on this idea of queer and queer solidarity, even if, and I can't stress this enough, you are someone who is just like really, really, really offended by my use of queer. Sorry, not sorry. And I think this is where we get to step off onto the first part of my research rabbit hole, which was me being confused to why it is some people think it's a slur. Again, it just wasn't like a thing for me growing up as a child, even in a really, really conservative upbringing in a really conservative town. This idea of using queer as a slur just was not like a thing for me. And that's where I will say I was a little surprised when I found an NPR article that was written where a bunch of people really were like conflicted about like whether they should be using queer to describe people in their articles, which was fascinating to read, but not at all grounded in my lived experience of the word. And I want to be clear, I don't think this article is a waste of time. It was enlightening for me, and I also think it made a lot of sense for them to write. If you think that your editor-in-chief is greenlighting the use of a slur against your community in articles, that's appropriate to go, hey, maybe we should have a conversation. Teacher, are we cool with this? Like, if you were in just like normal school and someone started dropping the N-word and they're like, oh, I'm just like quoting, I'm just quoting some Tom Sawyer. Like, we would all have to stop and have a question of ethics when we think a slur is being casually dropped in a conversation. I totally understand the article. I understand that this was a really important work to write to unpack a meaningful conversation for some of the people there, but also for me, I really was reading it not with like yes, this was a conversation that I'm happy we're having now. I get it, I knew it, that we were gonna get to the can we say queer discourse on NPR. I was in this boat of, oh, this is an interesting article. Say more. Why do you care? And that's where we got to learn some cool stuff. Now, this is the part where I have to discuss, not have to, I'm choosing to, discuss the very long rabbit hole I had to get down to get to the same understanding of queerness as I'd say someone who like firsthand experienced it as a slur would know. This is where, if you are someone who wants to learn a lot of weird little research intricacies that went into this video, and also go on a little rabbit hole with me about the history of the word queer, then stay here, because we are going to have a great time. I promise. Now, if you're someone who's like, I was promised in this video, what is queer was just going to be told to me, and then we were going to talk about some queer solidarity stuff, you are perfect, you're amazing, I love you, go to this time code here, and you will get to that juicy stuff right away. And you won't have to learn any weird, stupid stuff that actually isn't super important to what we're doing, but my little ADHD brain decided that it was going to learn everything about this topic, and I refused to say no. So, with all that said, let us enter the rabbit hole.
How do you keep from falling into a rabbit hole? Rabbit!
You can suck my rabbit hole. Okay. Yeah.
So, first, I read the article from NPR where they described the use of the word queer as a slur. That triggered my interest, so I started Googling around for other articles that at least gave like a historical background to it, because that NPR article was about like the moment, about today, 2019, about like people at that time complaining. I wanted to know like where they were coming from though historically. And that's where I found something from the Australian Broadcast Corporation that promised to be a brief history of the word queer, or like the use of queerness in politics. That got me nothing. So I dug a little bit deeper and I found the Australian Queer Archive. The Australian Queer Archive that claimed to have the 100 things that described the history of queerness. And I will tell you, it was not the definitive queer archive, because at no point does it explain when queer was used as a slur. Now, is that because it was never used as a slur in Australia? Who knows?
Jeez, you put out a good spread, mate.
But I no longer trust the definitive Australian queer archive of 100 things that were 100 gay, queer, gay things that definitely taught us everything we needed to know. Wasn't that, so we had to go deeper. So after realizing that maybe my problem is that Australians aren't the ones that invented the idea of queer being a slur, good for you, by the way. Keep not innovating in that way. I had to go back to my awful time at grad school and go to the How to Research 101 section of my life that I tried to purposefully dump from my brain and never pull up again. So I, being a good researcher, actually pulled up the dictionary. Not because I wanted the dictionary definition of queer. It's because the dictionary always includes the word's origins, historically and linguistically, which means it probably includes a citation to its definition of when queer was coined as a slur. And that's where it turns out that Merriam-Webster's dictionary did in fact have a use of the word queer as a slur in 1894, where they do make very clear that that is like the time, that's like the slurry use of it. It's a mean word, it's a bad word, no saying. 1894, that's what they say. So I guess case closed. We did it, we got to 1894, except I have two problems. The first, they don't give a citation for where 1894 comes from. And while I would like to believe that they didn't just like invent a random thing, at this point I was in too deep. And I would like to at least know why they're saying a very specific year. Like they don't say 1890s or like 1800s unknown. They seemed very confident on this 1894. And so I want to know why. And the other part is this doesn't really give me good historic context. Like I guess it reaffirms what I already knew. Oldie times, we had slurry use. Today we have groupie use, with older people that are like in between are conflicted on that. Which is great, and that confirms what I already knew, but I don't want to confirm what I already knew. I wanted to learn something new. So we had to find the actual thing that they're citing for this 1894 definition. So that is where I then began Googling queer 1894 and searching through Google Scholar, lots of different academic journal databases that I have access to, and just Google itself, trying to find anything. And then I found a nice little set of information from a group called like Dazed Magazine, the citation will be below, about this individual that apparently coined the term and like made it be really used as a slur, John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry. Yes, his full name is John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry. Now, could I just call him like John Douglas of Queensberry and we would be able to fully understand who I'm talking about? Yes, but as a trans woman, I feel like it's an act of solidarity for me to use his full God-given chosen name for the rest of this video when I'm discussing him. So, John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, is how we shall be referring to him, and if you decide to talk about this video or the history of queerness later in your life, you must say, John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry. Anything else, and actually you're a bad ally. That has been confirmed as a fact of the world. Now, at this point, the reason why John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, has entered our story is not because he did anything queer. It's because he had a probably gay son who was in a probably gay relationship with the definitely gay, and I cannot believe that they are entering into this story at this point, Oscar fucking Wilde is involved in this story. Oscar Wilde, on top of making beautiful poetry and being a great writer, was also apparently really good at dicking down the John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry's son, and at least that's what we can guess because they wrote beautiful poetry to each other like this.
My own boy, your sonnet is quite lovely, and it is a marvel that those red rose-leaf lips of yours should be made no less for the madness of music and song than for the madness of kissing. Your slim gilt soul walks between passion and poetry. I know Hyacinthus, whom Apollo loved so madly, was you in Greek days. Why are you alone in London, and when do you go to Salisbury? Do go there to cool your hands in the grey twilight of Gothic things, and come here whenever you like. It is a lovely place, and it lacks only you. But go to Salisbury first. Always with undying love, yours, Oscar.
My God, when the gays write poetry, they go hard. And I just want to make this very clear. I love that this poetry exists, and I love that Oscar Wilde had a great time with John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry's son. Okay, so when John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, learned of this relationship between Oscar Wilde and his son, not Oscar Wilde's son, John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry's son, that ultimately led to John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, saying, I'm going to have Oscar Wilde arrested and charged under the sodomy laws that existed at the time. And that is where, during the trial of Oscar Wilde, John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, wrote out the following line: "Snob queers." Seriously, that was the best insult he could come up with? Now you may be thinking at this point, well, it looks like you figured out the origin of the word and you now understand at least like the loose historical context of its origin, so we don't need to like go any deeper. Like, you cracked the case, we're done, it's over. Except for one thing, which is they don't actually provide any links to a first-hand account of this, and they don't cite why it is that they're saying that this is the origin. Like, there's no original letters, there's no first-hand citations, and I couldn't leave good enough alone. I wanted to figure out where this supposedly famous letter that, like, changed the direction of a word for 60 years actually exists and what it says. So we had to go one layer deeper. So, and I promise you that this was not me being lazy, I actually went to the Wikipedia page for John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, and actually this story is corroborated on his Wikipedia page. Doesn't definitively prove anything, but it's at least a lime green flag, like a light green, not full green though. And they also have a citation for that in there that doesn't just loop me back to the article that didn't have a primary source. And that's where we had to be able to assess the credibility of the book and make sure that it actually like is accurate as a citation, even though I wasn't going to be able to read the whole thing cover to cover. And you may be thinking, well, why do you have any reason to doubt the accuracy of the book? And honestly, actually, maybe a little bit. Red flag number one, and this is kind of a real red flag, kind of not. The main author of the book, I don't think has the greatest attention to detail, because when they wrote about John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, he just refers to him as John Douglas of Queensberry at points, which is not his name, and that worries me that there's not great attention to detail going on here. Now, the second reason is that the author of the book, Merlin, we're going to go with Merlin Holland, is in fact a direct descendant of Oscar Wilde and is related to Oscar Wilde, and that's where that actually lowers the credibility a little bit for me until I can actually know where he gets this claim from and if he's citing a primary source, because I worry that he may be overstating the importance of Oscar Wilde and his history in the world. And again, it's just all I need at this point is any primary source that just confirms this whole thing, or someone who like claims to actually have the real primary document just in some way visible, because I just don't want to like randomly start saying a fun fact that's not true. So we had to go deeper in the rabbit hole. And this is where, for those of you that are curious, the breadcrumbs were very helpful, because now I have a year, probably 1894. I know some of the core people that were involved in it. I know the turn of phrase that I actually need to look up, which is snob queer, and I know that it's a court document, or it happened in a courtroom, which means it may have been formally recorded or witnessed by a judge or witnessed by other people who are like directly present in the room, who can state that it happened and they saw it, or that they have like some information about it. And that's where I finally got to the British Royal Archive, which had an original copy of the letter actually saved on file that actually cites this whole idea that the term snob queer was from a letter that the John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, wrote, and then that letter was read aloud in the court. That is good enough for me. That all cites to me that this is all accurate, it makes sense, we're good, and I just needed to go through a long, long rabbit hole to figure out this one stupid fun fact about the origin of the word queer. So, there you go. We now know where the origin of the word queer comes from. 1894, Oscar Wilde fucked someone, and then John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, got very mad and called him a snob queer, and then it stuck. Which is great. That also can explain why it's older queer people that may have some issue, because if it's 1894, that probably carried through a little bit for some people, and it was starting to gain popularity during that time. But if you're someone who's like made it through the gay liberation movement of the 70s, where we began reclaiming the word slowly, we did it. We have now pieced the story together. It matches up with our understanding of reality, it gives us some context, and it helps us know this word actually hasn't been a slur for that long. So you may be thinking that this was all just a bunch of useless information of queer is sometimes a slur, it's sometimes not. It depends on the context, and it depends on who's saying it and the time period. But this is all actually very helpful, because this idea that queer used to be a slur, that its origins in 1894 was to call someone a snob queer, and that's actually a term of degrading them, of insulting them, and of weakening them. And now today, it's actually the mouthfeel is better on queer. The mouthfeel is good. It rolls right off the tongue for me. I like the word. It's a top tier word. S tier. Now, the important question that comes from this is why? Why did this reclaiming happen, and why does it matter? And to answer that question, we're going to have to go to someone who basically reconfigured our entire language around gender and, by proxy, sexuality. It's time for us to become critically queer.
I worked so hard to force it down, but all the colors of the rainbow, they just kept leaking out. Ha!
There, does that hat look good? Okay, there. I had the notes as this costume change, serving bisexual but has only ever dated women, and I think we got the look. In their 1993 journal article, Critically Queer, Judith Butler expands a lot on the ideas that they began to introduce on this idea of like queerness and gender that was brought up in their groundbreaking book, Gender Trouble. Now I know what you're thinking at this point. Oh wow, another trans YouTuber is now quoting Judith Butler at me. And listen here, this is not another chapter where I'm just going to go through beginning to end on what the word performative means, or what it means to make a performative action or proclamation. I think that matters, but for this video we actually don't need to know it, at least not in any real meaningful depth. And it also makes it so that way we can actually have a conversation that's more about something that I think is one of the lesser talked about components of their work. And that's where a major takeaway that I pull from reading Queer Trouble is this idea of queerness being used as a turn of phrase to create an in-group in society and an out-group in society, with queerness being understood as a sort of breaking from the norm, a breaking from cis and heterosexual society that ultimately makes it so to be queer is to explicitly exist outside of the power structures of the world. To say that another way, because you are queer, or you are someone who is queer in some way, you are ultimately someone who is subjected to power and subjected to power structures. You are rarely someone who gets to define your own destiny within those structures.
The term queer emerges as an interpolation that raises the question of the status of force and opposition, of stability and variability within performativity. The term queer has operated as one linguistic practice whose purpose has been the shaming of the subject it names, or rather, the producing of a subject through that shaming interpolation. Queer derives its force precisely through the repeated invocation by which it has become linked to accusation, pathologization, insult. This is an invocation by which a social bond among homophobic communities is formed through time. The interpolation echoes past interpolations and binds the speakers as if they spoke in unison across time.
And that's where this idea that queerness is used to pathologize and otherize people also actually is something where it makes it become a sort of new turn of phrase, a sort of new way of conceptualizing your power in society. Because let me just take you on a wild thought experiment that I promise is not something that Butler writes themselves. This is me being a weirdo. Imagine, if you will, you decide to enter a coffee shop and you are a queer. Just imagine for a moment you are a queer. You then decide to begin a gender war, a badass, really cool gender war, where you're going to be like, I'm going to take all of the non-cis people, we shall rally as one, and we will fight those sissies hard. We will fight them till the end. That sounds really cool, until you remember the cis make up 99% of the population, the transies, the transes, I think that's the politically correct term that I think I can use to describe my own community. We only make up 1% of the population. So, good luck winning that one. You will lose. So, as a fact of the world, when violence is exercised in this enforcement of gender, it goes one way. It goes one way because there's just really no real institutional threat that trans people form. Because in that most radical example of what about like revolution, what about an extreme expansion of gender war, you won't win. We won't win. So what do we do with that? And I didn't just bring up that thought experiment because I wanted to, like, help the alternate history subreddits think of another really, really dumb hypothetical. Although I do encourage the map porn circle jerk subreddit to please debate vigorously about what I just said here. Guys, which would win on this map? The United States of America or the San Francisco Republic of California? Queer people just are powerless to non-queer people to some degree, or at least have less power. For example, the fact that queer people are accepted and welcome in society is not a fact that we can take for granted. I mean, there was a period of time where cross-dressing laws and sodomy laws were used to basically criminalize gay and transness in general. There have been entire major conflicts within second wave and now today third wave feminism explicitly about the role of lesbians and bi people and trans people in these movements and whether or not we actually deserve any of the liberation that they advocate for. And that's where this becomes especially important when we think about the modern context, which is that ultimately there are forces today that are non-queer forces that want to make sure that queer people ultimately are restricted in the world. Who we have the right to love, who we have the right to marry, who it is that we are actually allowed to be, both in our declaration, in our identity, and in our safety, are at risk. There are HRT bans being implemented around the United States, right now targeted at minors, but that's but it's not, in my eyes, guaranteed that that's where this movement stops. And there is a genuine danger that exists for trans people even when you aren't facing health care being taken away from you. And this restriction of our power, this exercise of non-queer people being above queer people, doesn't just begin with state legislators, and it especially doesn't end with state legislators. It also happens when just a random county clerk decides that they're no longer going to validate marriage licenses. It happens when a baker says that they don't want to make a cake for a specific group of people because of who they are and because of who they love. And it also happens when a student in Oklahoma is not able to receive the same sort of care and support and protection that other students get by default, and are bullied to the point where they view that there's just no value to their life anymore. These are sometimes small things. These are sometimes individual instances of bigotry. They are sometimes systemic. They are sometimes emblematic of a bigger problem, but they all, for sure, are allowed to continue because of this framework that gets introduced of the queerness of people intrinsically putting you in an out-group, in a group that is lower in power and authority and your ability to challenge the world than what is given to the in-group, the group that gets to decide all of the power. To put this in the language of Judith Butler, the queer people ultimately bear all of the social injury that happens because of our queerness and hold the least amount of ability to define for ourselves how queerness places us in society. You may be listening to all of what I just said there and thinking to yourself, you're right. There is nothing that queer people can do. We are powerless within the system. We have no authority within the system and are completely at the whim of the non-queer people. So we should just give up. We should lie down and rot. We are black-pilled. That just factually isn't true. It's just a fact that actually there is an avenue for power to be generated. Now, we're going to get into how you generate that power, but let me just lay it out for you as to why I think it's actually just a non-controversial fact of the world that that power exists. In the 1970s, it was legal to fire someone for being gay in most of the country. It was borderline illegal to be trans in public. It was legal for the police to engage in one-directional, involuntary genital inspections of random people. It was basically considered illegal for you to be in a sexually gay relationship. In the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic was allowed to rage basically unmitigated for years, if not decades, because many conservative governments at the time held as a de facto stance that actually it is just and right for gay people to die of this very good disease that doesn't affect the non-queer people. All of those things were true in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it took a lot of work, and a lot of work, to dismantle those systems and to break them down. But the work worked.
Emily in the editing bay here. I feel like that this line comes across like I'm saying we righted all of the wrongs of the past and that, like, reparations occurred and that no more systemic injustice happens anymore. That wasn't what I meant. I meant that a lot of the legal structures that were created to explicitly enforce these limits on us did break down and were reduced, but I certainly do not believe, nor do I argue at all, that the systems of the world just work now and that there's not more work to do at dismantling those systems.
It's illegal to be gay today. Maybe a little shaky on how long that's going to hold. We'll see in November. But it's legal to be gay today. It's legal to be trans today. Involuntary genital inspections by police, otherwise known as legalized sexual assault by cops, is more or less illegal now. It actually isn't socially acceptable to do these things. And that's a major, major shift that has happened largely because of the solidarity and groundwork done by gay people and queer people in general to ultimately reframe how the social injury is brought upon us and to weaken how much those in power desire exercising that power to inflict that social injury. And that's where the next thing we need to talk about, if we're going to get to the how you build more of that solidarity, more of how it is that you continue to make the progress that was made in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, is to understand the idea of queerness as a involuntary label. That meaning, you are someone, you may be bisexual or gay or trans, and you actually, through a lot of this conversation, through a lot of this video, have been going like, yeah, this is all very good stuff, but I don't identify with queer. I don't identify with queer at all, and so this doesn't really apply to me. It's not a conversation I need to have. Well, let me tell you this, and let me make this very clear. The involuntary label that is described by Judith Butler is exactly what you may think. You may just sing till the cows come home. You can talk all day about how you're not queer, but ultimately, the world's gonna pin that label on you. You're gonna hold it, no matter what you want, no matter how much you want it, no matter how much you try. You are queer, because that's a fact. You're in the out group, and the in group, the one with the power, gets to decide who's in that in group. Let me give you an example that may be a little less at home for some people, or at least one that I think will make it that is a different way to think about this in-group, out-group, involuntary label idea, which is, y'all know that, like, we apply an involuntary label of, like, being a person of color, right? Like, it's not actually defined by any level of pigmentation of your skin. It's 100% defined by whether or not your culture, your society, your language, your accent, all, like, pass as white. Y'all know, like, Germans weren't considered white people for a long time, right? Like, Benjamin Franklin famously wrote of, like, the swarthy Germans who were, like, not white enough for him. Germans were not white enough for Benjamin Franklin.
Why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our anglifying them? And will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Which leads me to add one remark. The number of people, purely white people in the world, is proportionally very small. All Africa is black or tawny. Asia, chiefly tawny. America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth.
That's what an involuntary label is a German showing up on a ship, pulling into Pennsylvania, going, "Hallo Leute, ich bin weiß," and then Benjamin Franklin going, "Too swarthy, get out of here, you don't deserve rights, I actually hate you, you ain't white." Do you think to that German that was, like, groundbreaking information? Yes, but that German could also all day go around saying, like, "I am white, hello, I am white, ich bin weiß." They can do that as much as they want, but if no one else who has power, if the people in power in society don't allow them to hold that label, they will involuntarily enforce upon them the label of swarthy. And that's where involuntary labels are exactly that. It doesn't matter your preferences, it doesn't matter what you want or why or how you want to be understood and viewed by the world. The world will tell you how it sees you when you are not someone in power. So the question is, what do you do with that involuntary label? The 2007 documentary Through Deaf Eyes explores the creation of the modern deaf community through 1817 to today, with a lot of this exploration being framed around the creation and acceptance of education for deaf people via dedicated deaf schools. Now, these schools were a very important part of building the deaf community for the exact same reason why traditional public education was so important for the building of communities across America for non-deaf people. Because when you have a meeting place where ideas are shared, where communities are built, and where there's no limit to your ability to work with and communicate with people who may not be like yourself in many ways, community builds, and you create new, unique, and interesting ideas that drive a greater future among that group of people. And for deaf people, there's a unique additional layer to all of this, because deaf schools, traditionally and for most of modern history, have taught American Sign Language, or ASL, which is a form of communication that allows you to use just your hands to actually communicate everything. Now, this may sound like really obvious to some people here, but it's kind of important that we note that there's actually a second way that deaf people have often been trying to communicate with other people that doesn't require every single person, deaf and non-deaf, to be able to speak ASL, and that's through lip reading, which becomes a more controversial idea as deaf history goes on and becomes a reoccurring theme of the documentary Through Deaf Eyes. And that's where there actually is an internal conflict that begins to develop among the deaf community in the 1800s, where there began to be a sort of combat between ASL and lip-reading type people, which honestly was reframed in some ways as those who wish to build and maintain a deaf community and a deaf identity, that being the people who learned ASL and believed that ASL was something that needed to remain prominent in the deaf community, and those who believed in lip reading, those who viewed that as something that is foundational to reintegration and assimilation into the world, is dropping this idea of ASL, this idea of a deaf-only language, and instead having the ability to fully work with people who refuse to learn ASL, i.e., the overwhelming majority of non-deaf people. And just to be clear, non-deaf people were a part of this conversation too, but not as people who wanted to just make sure that they were aware of what the deaf community wanted. They instead were active, regular engagers in the conversation. And a lot of this comes to a boiling point during the Second International Conference on the Education of the Deaf, or what was also known as the Milan Conference of 1880. Now, a lot happens in this conference, but the biggest thing is that a major vote is formed by the people who believed in lip reading as the primary form of communication, otherwise known as the Oralists, or more derogatorily, we could call them the Assimilationists, who were pushing during this conference the total banning of the use of ASL in deaf schools, i.e. it would become a lip-reading only environment. Now, due to the activism and the work done by the Oralists, the following two resolutions were passed during it, declaring the following.
The Convention, considering the incontestable superiority of articulation over signs in restoring the deaf-mute to society and giving him a fuller knowledge of language, declares that the oral method should be preferred to that of signs in the education and instruction of deaf-mutes. Second, the convention, considering the simultaneous use of articulation and sign, has the disadvantage of injuring articulation and lip reading, and the precision of ideas declares that the pure oral method should be preferred.
So all of this means that ultimately during that conference, the Oralists, a section of the deaf community, succeeded in their effort to ban ASL in schools and to make it so that way this lip reading approach, this Oralist approach, became the only one that was allowed to be taught in schools. This has actually been known by some deaf historians to be one of the most consequential events in deaf history, and would permanently reshape the conversation around how deafness was going to maintain a sense of community, and whether that was right and whether that was just, and also whether it was actually important that this community be maintained, or whether it fully assimilates back into the non-deaf world. And this banning of ASL actually created a very legitimate risk of ASL dying off and going away without even having to remove deafness from the world. In the same way that many Native American languages, many Native indigenous languages have gone away, despite their tribes still existing, because of the power of these efforts at assimilation and at trying to remove people's connection to their historic culture and to their old traditions. Now, another really important detail that comes into this whole conversation of the Oralists versus people who wanted to do ASL and to keep sign language in deaf schools is the fact that the leader of the Oralists, one of the most prominent Oralists at the time, was actually a little-known inventor of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, who was deeply interested in how the deaf community was to advance over his lifetime. And this wasn't purely out of selfish, weird, invested interest. This did come to some degree from the fact that he did have a deaf wife, and he was actually considered a fairly prominent educator in the deaf community. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that Alexander Graham Bell's close connection to the deaf community and his advocacy about the direction it needed to go was not rooted in this altruistic ideal of he wanted to just push for what was best. He deeply and profoundly believed that the best result of the long-term future of the deaf community was its eradication. He wanted to break up the community. He wanted to make it so deaf people stopped marrying each other and started marrying hearing people, thinking deafness was a genetic thing that we could actually breed out of society. Important to note at this point, he was a well-known and prominent eugenicist, i.e., he wasn't what we call in the industry a good dude. He was not woke, and he is cancelled. And that's where, after this 1880 Milan conference, a real dark period for deaf people forms. They were facing increased they were being increasingly ostracized by the hearing community. They were finding themselves ultimately losing more and more spaces that were just for them. They were being increasingly pushed by their own peers to stop using a language that enabled community in their schools, and instead to view themselves as intrinsically secondary to the hearing, and that they must inconvenience themselves to accommodate hearing people. Now, despite all of these major challenges and all of this legitimate pressure that existed during that time for the eradication of deaf people, they nevertheless persisted for two major reasons that I could tease out. The first is honestly hearing people still viewed, very controversially, that the deaf probably shouldn't be put in the camps, and they probably should be allowed to just die off on their own. that passiveness to the eradication of deaf people was something that slowed down and ultimately allowed time to recoup and rebuild some of the lost communities that the Milan Conference created. The second part was actually a little more ingenious and a little more of a consequence of the realities of deaf people. They still needed an education, and you can do every accommodation you can. Ultimately, at some point, you need a dedicated school that is able to provide the type of attention and additional support that a deaf person will need to comprehend all the material. Just simply because if you can't hear your teacher, you can be the best lip reader in the world, but anytime they turn away to the whiteboard, you are kind of SOL. So you need a teacher that is cognizant of that, and hearing schools weren't going to provide that. The continued existence of these deaf schools, even with the banning of the teaching of ASL, made it so you could actually learn ASL from your peers in secret. And you could actually continue to learn it and develop it in an underground network, and it ultimately wouldn't die, and it would have an opportunity to come back into the mainstream of your community once you got through this dark period of the oralist tradition. Now, both of those are major parts to the story of why Alexander Graham Bell ultimately wasn't able to win, despite nearly achieving victory at the Milan Conference and actually building a major movement within the deaf community that sought to ban all forms of ASL being taught in deaf schools. And it's because Alexander Graham Bell failed in this project that many years later the president of the National Association of the Deaf, George Veditz, ultimately described him as with the following sentence:
He comes in the guise of a friend, and therefore the most to be feared enemy of the American deaf, past or present.
I think the power of the solidarity that George Veditz ultimately built in the deaf community can be best expressed by watching his movie, The Preservation of Sign Language. Now, I'm not going to play the whole video, but I will have it linked below, and I highly encourage you to watch it yourself as well at any point. But I do want to play just one section that I think deeply and genuinely just impacts me to my core when I watch Alexander Veditz sign in this movie. I want to be clear, I actually felt a very strong sense of being seen and of feeling like there was some deep, profound connection that the struggle of queer liberation can absolutely pull from the struggle for deaf liberation from the following line. They think they know all about educating the deaf, but they know nothing of their thoughts and their souls. That is a powerful line. One that I don't want to just completely appropriate from the context of deafness for myself, but one that I think if we were to recontextualize that sentence, not just as one of deaf people, but of all people who have had an involuntary label put on them, the power of it becomes just all the more profound. Now, just to be clear, the reason why I wasted like maybe 5-10 minutes of your life and 20 to 80 hours of mine doing all this work learning about deafness is not just to give you some cool fun facts about George Veditz or that Alexander Graham Bell is a eugenicist. It's because the movement of deaf liberation and the efforts and the low moments and the high moments and the realities of the involuntary label of deafness being placed on that community ultimately informs how queerness can be used in that same way as an involuntary label that we don't get to choose, but as one that we can bring together to the forefront of building our own liberation. And that's where the through line, I think, begins with this idea that deaf people did, at a period of time, think that assimilation would work, or at least enough of their leadership and major members of the community believed in assimilation that it led to the Milan Conference and it led to the banning of ASL. But there was a realization among the real people of the deaf community, among all of the people that were impacted by that decision, that ultimately there's just too many differences between the way the world works for a deaf person and the way it works for a hearing person to do assimilation in a way that doesn't lead to the eradication and destruction of your culture. It destroys your language, your ability to have community. It destroys the very fabric of why your schools exist, and it can destroy your ability to have any real political solidarity. And this is not something that I think I'm just putting on to the deaf community on its own. I think this is a really obvious fact, because if it wasn't going to work, if the idea of banning ASL didn't intrinsically meant the destruction of a lot of deaf culture, community, and language, then why was it that eugenicists who were trying to remove deafness from the world viewed assimilation as the way they would achieve it? Alexander Graham Bell wasn't an assimilationist because it was in the best interest of the deaf. He was an assimilationist because he knew it would destroy everything that it meant to be deaf. And this is a moment where I want to make sure that I properly highlight that deaf people preserved deaf culture because deaf people viewed deaf culture as worth preserving. One reason why they took on this label of disability and basically said, no, it is not a disability, it's actually just a different way of being in the world. That is an act that showed how much it mattered to the people that actually are in this space, that they don't assimilate, that they don't view themselves with language of secondary, that they don't allow themselves to accept anything less than a structure of the world that allows for community, for culture, for language. They took the involuntary label of deaf, the involuntary label of disabled, and actually turned these into, or even just wholesale flipped them into different terms and phrases and structures that enabled this culture to live because they viewed it as a culture that deserved to live. So does this mean that the existence of hearing people and hearing culture, whatever that may be, is actually just intrinsically toxic to deaf people and intrinsically bad for them? No, obviously not. And also this doesn't mean that the solution for deaf people is the total secession from society. Deaf children still exist in the same communities as hearing children. They still exist all around in our neighborhoods. Some deaf people actually do embrace modern medical inventions like cochlear implants. The controversy of that I'm not going to touch with a 10-foot pole, but some people do it. And all of that leads to this idea that this really isn't about secession versus assimilation. Instead, it's about the fact that there's only two real choices, that a community that is viewed as an outgroup but has a unique and distinct culture and flavor and joy and beauty to add to the world ultimately has at the end of the day. Option one is assimilation, which creates this genuine deep risk of the destruction of your culture, your history, your traditions, your communities. And maybe for some groups that's something you're okay with. And That is an option some groups have chosen, and an option that sometimes those with power have forced upon the marginalized. Or option 2 was to embrace solidarity, embrace your community's culture, embrace that there's something unique and beautiful that it adds to the world, and that you can figure out how to make all of that stay and exist and be flourishing while still keeping it linked and connected to the world of the normal society, of deaf people having to link with non-deaf, of queer people having to link with non-queer, of colored people having to link with white people. We can actually, in all of these instances, see through the debates and arguments and discussion of this second option coming to fruition and succeeding. But ultimately, every community has to make that choice, and every member of that community has to make that choice. You either assimilate and lose something of yourself and something of your people, or you remain unique and you figure out how to cooperate, but also coexist within the world without losing anything. And some people might propose that there's a third option that exists, of secession, or of leaving all of normal society. I can't think of an example where it really worked without you having a nation state backing you to colonize some new piece of land somewhere. But if it's something that you can do, then we can discuss it in actual depth at that point. But for now, we'll just keep that as a hypothetical 20-30 video essay that I'll spend 800 hours on maybe. But we're gonna not really pretend that this is a practical idea in the real world that we live in. So over the course of this video, I think there are a few takeaways that we can all pull. The first is, if you are not cis and or straight, you are a queer. The second, if you're a queer, you exist in contrast to non-queer society. 3, because you exist in contrast to non-queer society, you ultimately will always exist with some form of tension with non-queer society, because your lived experiences, your realities of the world, the contributions you give to the world by not being a part of normal, everyday society, and also just the realities of how you challenge many assumptions that those in power have, make it impossible for you to not exist with some level of tension with those in power, whoever that may be for you in the context you're in. And 4, when we look at the parallel of the journey that was taken by deaf people in their fight for liberation that is still ongoing, we know that queer people are ultimately left with a choice of whether we want to assimilate into non-queer society or we want to break free and be something that is our own, but ultimately managing the tension that will exist with non-queer people. There is one really important lesson that I took from this and that I hope you also take from this. We learned 2 choices that a queer person can really make with the direction they want the community to go: assimilation or being radically free, being able to take the involuntary label of queerness and holding it yourself, taking power away from those who have power over us, and embracing that while we suffer all the social injury of being queer, we get to decide what queerness means, and we get to push forward with liberation of queer people, not assimilation. I know what choice I want to make in that fight. I know which choice is mine, and I don't think you have to make the same choice as me. But I would encourage you, if you think that you know some really great non-queer people in your life who are really, really interested in you being an advocate for assimilation, and that actually you can be the one who is able to assimilate into non-queer society, leave behind everyone else, and that really that's the option we need to choose, is a radically individualist approach to the queer community and to our future. Let me ask you this. Do they come to you in the guise of a friend?